Welcome, everyone. We at the Program for Torture Victims, PTV, are thrilled to have you join us for today's special presentation. Founded 40 years ago, PTV provides trauma-responsive therapy, case management, medical care, and forensic evaluations for asylum-seeking immigrants who are survivors of torture. In today's presentation, we seek to deepen dialogue around power and bias within therapy to amplify a multitude of perspectives on healing outside of the Western Eurocentric theories and ideologies. My name is Sandra Ochoa. I am an advocate and case manager at PTV.
And hi everyone, welcome. I'm Carol Gomez and I'm the clinical director at PTV and also a therapist and community organizer. Andrique and I will be co-moderating this event. And while Robin is giving a presentation, we will be muted. We all will be muted except for the moderators and staff during this time. We welcome you to direct your questions or comments throughout the presentation in the chat box. I will be, both Andrique and I will be funneling the questions to Robin during the Q&A after her presentation is done. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but given time, we may not be able to do so for everyone. So just bear with us and be patient. But welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Tara, I'm a program manager at PTV. This event will be recorded. It is being recorded right now, and we'll be sending you the recording after. You can feel free to leave your video on or off, whatever you're most comfortable with. Everyone is on mute at this time, as we mentioned, and we'll be able to request you to unmute if you have anything you want to say during Q&A. You can raise your hand on Zoom or physically on camera. If you have any issues hearing audio, please make sure that your device is connected through device audio and not your phone or call-in. If you're having internet connectivity problems, you can consider moving closer to your Wi-Fi or use an Ethernet cable. Alternatively, you can call in to listen to this meeting. I'll be sharing the number again in our chat box.
And now let's welcome our main speaker today, Robin Chancer.
Hi everyone, I'm Robin Chancer. I'm a therapist with PTV, and thank you all very much for being here with us today. To get started, I would love to get a sense of who you are, who all is here with us. So we have a short poll for everyone to fill out that asks you who you are in your community. You might be able to choose more than one, but if you don't mind taking a couple minutes to fill that out, that would help me a lot. I initially planned this presentation as a roundtable discussion for a conference that's happening in November. And then that conference got moved virtually, so I changed it to more of a virtual friendly format. And then we decided to let it evolve and have our own virtual event. But my goal is still to have some sort of dialogue as much as we can on Zoom. So I'd love to get a sense of who you are so that I can know what's most relevant to you and we can tailor it to your needs and interests. And as Carol said, during this presentation, if you have thoughts or questions that come up, please feel free to share them in the chat box. And then after my presentation, after about 45 minutes, we will open it up for discussion, and that will be another 45 minutes of time for us to engage together. So looking at the poll, it looks like we have a great diverse group of people here, therapists, case managers, administrators, participants in therapy, educators, healthcare workers, and others. I'm sorry, I wish we could allow you to tell us who you are, but we couldn't figure out how to do that with the poll itself, but hopefully afterward we'll have a chance to do that. So thank you all very much. And you should hopefully be able to see my screen now, which is my slide presentation. And I'm calling it Therapy and Justice, Unpacking Western Bias and Expanding Healing.
Oh, Robin, you're on mute.
Thank you. I was moving my little menu here and I accidentally muted myself. So to get started, I'm going to give us a quote from Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to swim upstream and find out why they're falling in. So one of the centering questions that I think about in framing this conversation is, how has your race shaped you as a therapist? This is something I would love for us to just start thinking about and to share as we have our time together at the end to dialogue. And to get us thinking about that, I wrote down some quotes from Audre Lorde from Sister Outsider. And this is from a letter that she wrote to her own therapist, who was a Black woman. I can't tell you how many good white psych women have said to me, why should it matter if I am Black or white? Who would never think of saying, why does it matter if I am female or male? I doubt that your training can have prepared you to explore the tangle of need, fear, distrust, despair, and hope which operates between us, and certainly not to the depth necessary. Black women belong to a group of human beings that has not been thought worthy of that kind of study. So let me give you some introduction to why I wanted to have this discussion. I approach this topic from a place of humility and searching. My goal is to foster dialogue. I am not an expert so much as wanting to continue to foster this discussion in our field. I've been working with recent immigrants and asylum seekers for almost 15 years. And not long into my career, I began to see how little of my training was relevant to the people I see. I'm aware that many US trained therapists like me lack exposure to non-Western paradigms of healing. We may receive passing trainings on cultural competence, but rarely engage in depth on issues like anti-racism work or culturally specific methods to foster well-being. As recently as last year, let me move this. I've heard white therapists say things like, I relate to everyone as a human being, regardless of their race. We really need to separate politics from our relationships, and I'm really uncomfortable talking about issues of race. Negative interactions, microaggressions, and cultural ignorance are commonplace in therapy. A few examples that come to mind for me as I think about this. A friend once told me about her first session with a white therapist. And when she told the therapist she was from Mexico, the therapist responded, "Oh, that's such a beautiful country." She was taken aback and did not return to this therapist. Her thought here was, what if I have had bad experiences in Mexico? What if I don't think of Mexico as a pleasant and beautiful place? To her, the therapist having that instinctual reaction let her know a lot about this therapist and that she wasn't necessarily present with my friend as her client in her experience. Noah Halpin, who's founder of This Is Me, a transgender healthcare campaign, recently shared on Twitter a very intrusive experience with a psychiatrist. During the first appointment with this psychiatrist, Halpin was asked a series of explicit, what he called voyeuristic questions about his sexuality, such as, do you watch gay porn? And things like, what positions do you like? And the psychiatrist wanted to know in detail, and he was told that he had to answer in order to proceed with hormone replacement therapy. Another example is a client of mine recently challenged me saying, I don't appreciate your suggestion that I go for a walk or run outside. You must not fully understand how dangerous that is for me as a Black man. And we had been talking about COVID and maintaining mental health during quarantine. And so I had thrown out some ideas such as being outside and getting exercise outside. And my client let me know how short-sighted that was considering his experience. He was saying, I wear an ankle bracelet because of my immigration status. It's really not safe for me to walk or run outside in the park. Last year, I attended a conference with others who work with refugees and asylum seekers. The presenters were white, and they referenced the work of white men and women. So I noted this in a discussion, and their responses were illuminating, I thought. A white therapist said, I always think it doesn't matter our skin color. I connect to each person as a human being, kind of wanting to say, I don't really see color in it, and I don't think it's relevant most of the time to therapy because I can relate to everyone as a human. And then a Black therapist replied, if you said that to me, I would wonder, do you see my race? Do you see my gender? Because those things are very much present for me in the room. And then one of the lecturers became what I perceived as defensive, saying, what, should we give up our jobs and give them to our clients? Then he said, why don't we center the voices of plants and animals? Which I guess was his way of saying, you know, if we're going to center our clients, then why not anything? Why not plants and animals? And this really stuck with me. It was sort of the triggering moment that made me want to have this discussion and to further these topics in our field in general. So I thought I would cover a brief history of Western bias in psychotherapy. Many of you may already know a lot of this, but it helps me to review it just so it's clear and fresh in my mind. Historically and around the world, emotional healing was often cultivated through a variety of community healers, shamans, and spiritual teachers. Such approaches tended to foster a sense of care, belonging, and meaning. The professionalization, medicalization, and commodification of psychological treatment emerged through colonial capitalist forces. Beginning with Freud, the psychotherapist established himself as the expert, with the authority to diagnose and treat. Through colonization, the Western medical model was spread throughout the world, dominating and silencing countless paradigms for conceptualizing mental health and wellness. So here we have a cartoon that was printed in the New York Times in 1955 by Marcus Edwin called Darkest Africa, and it shows the way that the artist perceived the Western powers as viewing Africa as this giant black blob of unrest and nothing more nuanced or specific than that. There's a wonderful article that's listed at the end of my slides called History of Psychiatry in Indian Perspective, which delves deeply into this history and relates it to India in particular. And one of the quotes from that article that really stuck with me was, "The colonial bid to prove its legitimacy as a civilizing mission led to representation of European medicine as morally superior to the Eastern practices, resulting in a biased history. Although in reality, the history of psychiatry is heterogeneous and consists of many different scientific and cultural traditions, which vary between populations." There's also a wonderful article that was also in the New York Times, I think, in 2012, called The Americanization of Mental Illness. That author notes that we have for many years been busily engaged in a grand project of Americanizing the world's understanding of mental health and illness. We may indeed be far along in homogenizing the way the world goes mad. So here I've brought together some pictures of the people that I studied in my training. I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and graduated in 2006. And these were the people who we studied in depth. We read their works critically, we practiced their theories, we studied all of the context of where they came from. And as you can see, they all have something in common. We have Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, the behaviorists Pavlov, Skinner, and Wolpe, Aaron T. Beck from cognitive behavior therapy, Irvin Yalom, group therapy, among others, John and Julie Gottman, couples therapy, Marcia Linehan, dialectical behavior therapy, Richard Schwartz, internal family systems, and Murray Bowen from systems theory. So looking at them together helps me see and think about, you know, who did my educators think were the most important voices in our field? Who did we learn were the people who were the experts, the people whose minds and work deserves lots of attention and practice and study and research? These are some of the biases, some of the paradigms that such people held and that our field continues to hold today. Some of the messages that they use to frame mental health. There's a large emphasis on individualism versus community belonging, autonomy versus interdependence, the mind-body Cartesian split, the I think therefore I am, that the body is more of a vessel for the mind, which makes Western therapy very head-heavy, a lot of patriarchal emphasis on linear thought, reason, and logic. There's the codependence versus differentiation paradigm of relationships, heavy emphasis on developmental models, the minimized impact of politics and history. Illness is viewed as a personal aberration, rather than a response to a harmful system. There is an assumption that the therapist is somehow neutral or ahistorical. There's a heavy focus on individual pathology and coping, and the centrality of the medical model, that illness is caused by biological factors more than, say, historical or spiritual ones. And right now, that's where a lot of our funding is going, trying to find biological markers for mental illness, for example. We might consider the absurdity of extrapolating such paradigms to the rest of the world. This hit home for me working with people who are asylum seekers from Guatemala, which is the population I have the most experience with. Guatemala has a rich cultural history, and then it also suffered brutal colonization and genocide, a US-led coup in 1954, which overturned a democratically elected president, then a civil war, which lasted more than half a century, followed by extreme economic poverty and gang violence. Many asylum seekers come from indigenous groups and were discriminated against in Guatemala as a result. After journeying to the United States, they often endure the grueling, dehumanizing process of detention, immigration check-ins, ankle bracelets, family separation, the court system, living without documents, and the constant fear of deportation. So with that in mind, how do you respond to a message like this from Albert Ellis? The best years of your life are the ones in which you decide your problems are your own. You do not blame them on your mother, the ecology, or the president. You realize that you control your own destiny. You know, the fact that he is able to believe that is very much racialized. It has a lot to do with who he is in his society, which is the top of the hierarchy. He's a cis white man, and he then can come to believe that he has full control over his life and over his destiny because he more or less he has. And he's been the benefactor of systems that gave him that privilege. So you know, these are things that we really can't extrapolate to the rest of the world who have not had that same experience. There's a wonderful Instagram feed called @Decolonizing Therapy by Dr. Jennifer Mullen, who's really wonderful. I would highly recommend following her. And she recently posted this quote, which hit me hard. There is a real violence in continuing to allow white male theorists to take center stage in the mental health world. Psychology, social work, and counseling have really done a disservice by being complacent with who we want to hear from, who we push through, and who we are hiring. The fact that we then consider white male theorists as the standard bearers of our field has trickled down everywhere in our society and in our field, including in research and in treatment. This graph represents the psychology workforce, which is still over 80% white, which is not representative of the US population. And then Heinrich Heine and Nora Zion note that individuals from weird societies, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, make up 80% of samples in psychological research, though they are only 12% of the world's population. A lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of psychological research is done on university students because of access primarily, but also that's where the research is happening and where the funding is. So we take psychology students often or university students and we say whatever is true of them must be generalizable to the rest of the world, even though they are not representative of the majority of the world. And there's few signs of this changing in the near future. The chair and the vice chair of the DSM-5 task force were white male academics. Most psychiatry residents are still white. And this shows up in our treatment as well, this bias. There's many studies that note that Black people are much more likely to be diagnosed with psychotic disorders and to be institutionalized. In my experience, many psychiatrists aren't even aware of this. There was one really important study from 2019 that reported that in their study, Black patients were 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the race of the interviewer didn't make a statistical difference. So even Black interviewers overdiagnosed Black patients with schizophrenia. The biggest determining factor was whether the interviewer perceived the patient to be honest. Interviewers consistently perceived Black patients to be less honest than whites. And the conclusion they draw then is that these findings point to the potential importance of the patient-clinical relationship in contributing to race-related disparities in the diagnosis of schizophrenia, which appears to impact such disparities as much, if not more so, than the clinical presentation of the client. So something is very much going wrong in our ability to connect and to create trusting relationships across populations. And it may very well be that Black patients are less likely to trust us, which might make it seem as if they're sharing less. This is my theory, but they may have very good reason not to trust us. And we really need to look hard at what we are missing in terms of being able to connect and create positive relationships. We might think critically about the enormous harm that's been done by our field in the past and now. Hysteria, for example, introduced by Freud, silenced women and interpreted their physical symptoms as psychological pathology. And this really started us off on a long sexist footing, whatever the metaphor might be. But there's a book called Doing Harm about gender bias in the medical field that goes into this very in depth and talks about how what we now know is that likely many of Freud's clients were women who were suffering from very real things, such as sexual abuse or autoimmune disorders. But because Freud and the medical field couldn't figure out what it was that was causing their symptoms, they then lumped them into this category of hysterical patients and said they must have something wrong in their minds. And this continues today in our field, in the medical field, that if things are not medically explained, it must be something psychogenic, when the truth may be that we just don't yet know what's causing the symptoms. Autoimmune disorders are a pretty recent development in terms of medical discovery. And this continued on through things like conversion disorder and the somatoform disorders. I can't tell you how many clients have been referred to me because their doctors told them that whatever they were experiencing was all in their heads. So they come to see me not only suffering from whatever pain they're in, but then also thinking I must be crazy. There must be something psychologically wrong with me, and that adds an extra layer of silence and shame when they are clearly suffering from something very real, and it may be that the medical field is what is at fault. And then there's also the fact that the DSM labeled a range of sexual identities as psychological disorders, including homosexuality and transsexuality. This continued to be true up until the 1980s, and it had a long history of damage in our society and around the world. It's worth considering then how the mental health field has been, number one, a tool for assimilating many to colonizer culture. Colonizer culture being white, heterosexual, cisgender, and male. So those are the people who are viewed as standard human beings and everyone else is other. And so mental health then has been used to say, well, you must try to get yourself closer to normal, closer to colonizer culture, because then you will be healthy. Then you'll be a normal human being. And our field has also been, number two, a palliative measure to keep people from addressing the injustices in our society. Because if we focus on individual pathology and individual coping, we're not then addressing the injustices in our society that may be causing a lot of the suffering in the first place. Let me close the window, there's some noise outside. So as we think about this, I would encourage us to think about our work and our relationships and to take some time to reflect on with whom do you find yourself having trouble connecting? We all have those people. We all have people that we automatically connect with more and people that we struggle to do so with. If you pay attention to your physical and emotional responses to clients or to people you interact with at work or in your life, where do you find yourself shrinking away or getting defensive? Where do you find internally that you want to look away? Where do you lack cultural knowledge and vocabulary? When have you been challenged by a client and how did you respond? You know, I think about an example for me. I recently had a client who was a Black woman sharing that she felt like she was being overlooked at work, that she was not being groomed for leadership positions as some of her coworkers were. And I noticed that as she talked about this, I started to feel a little shifty, like I started to feel tense and uncomfortable. And I started reflecting on that a little bit and trying to figure out why that was. And what I came to is that I think I was feeling helpless and I didn't know how to help in this situation. And for that reason, it was hard for me to stay as present when that is not at all what she needed. What she needed was for me to be present and to validate the socio-political reality that she was experiencing. So I would ask us to consider that. And if you feel comfortable sharing later, please do. The therapeutic relationship then can be a place of violence. If our field is dominated by white theorists, researched primarily on white people, and led by predominantly white leaders, it is impossible that white therapists would not internalize a sense of superiority. We then replicate the dominating, colonizing dynamic in our therapy. This is another quote from Audre Lorde. The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us and which knows only the oppressor's tactics, the oppressor's relationships. We habitually relate to our clients as if we are an authority. And on a practical level, we have tremendous power. We are an authority. We have the power to affect someone's medical record. We have the power to institutionalize them. We might be able to impact whether they have employment, their immigration status, whether they can keep their children. Like it or not, we have enormous power. And if we are not thoughtful and careful, we can recreate the dominator-dominated relationship, however well-intentioned we may be. We may silence, minimize, deflect, and commit microaggressions. We may disconnect people from their most vital healing sources. Dr. Jennifer Mullen puts it like this: white therapy will leave us feeling gaslighted, inadequate, disconnected, and dead. One of the ways that we might do this is through the white savior complex. Teju Cole, who's a Nigerian-American journalist and photographer, wrote about this in 2012, starting with a series of tweets, and then he wrote an Atlantic article about it. And I wanted to read the tweets because I find them really powerful. From Saks to Christoph to Invisible Children to TED, the fastest growth industry in the US is the white savior industrial complex. The white savior supports brutal policies in the morning, founds charities in the afternoon, and receives awards in the evening. The banality of evil transmutes into the banality of sentimentality. The world is nothing but a problem to be solved by enthusiasm. This world exists simply to satisfy the needs, including, importantly, the sentimental needs of white people and Oprah. The white savior industrial complex is not about justice. It is about having a big emotional experience that validates privilege. And here you'll see a couple of photographs. The one on the right is of a protest in Nigeria. The one on the left is of a young white man surrounded by smiling Black children, holding one who is faceless, standing above the crowd, looking as if he's there to save them, to protect them, and they're all grateful for his presence. It's a great illustration of what the white savior complex looks like. An example he gives is the white savior industrial complex is a valve for releasing the unbearable pressures that build in a system built on pillage. So it comes from our enormous sense of guilt and shame. We can participate in the economic destruction of Haiti over long years, but when the earthquake strikes, it feels good to send $10 each to the rescue fund, when really those who are being helped ought to be consulted over the matters that concern them. You know, part of the danger of the white savior complex is that it feeds the fallacy of white innocence. That is the idea that white people want to believe they are innocent. We have a very hard time accepting the harm that we have done and that we continue to do And there's this automatic knee-jerk response to want to say, I am different. I am not one of the guilty white people. I see this now in so much response to the Black Lives Matter movement and to the death of George Floyd. There's this instinctual response to say, but I am not racist, and my community is not racist. There's this defensive reaction of, I have to defend myself. I have to believe that I am innocent, and I'll do whatever that takes. But if we're driven to believe we are good, then we are more likely to deny our mistakes, to minimize others' pain, and to become defensive. And this can be incredibly damaging interpersonally and socially as well. If we think about, for example, Emmett Till, that was another example where it fed the stereotype of the innocent white woman and the dangerous Black man. Or what happened in Central Park recently, it then feeds again into that narrative, and it can perpetrate enormous violence. So then how do we rethink things? How do we reconceptualize treatment? It's not easy, but I wanted to start to talk about ways that many start reconceptualizing therapy and mental health treatment. Dr. Jennifer Mullins says, therapy is a deeply political experience. We cannot heal drinking from a poisoned river. I would encourage us to think about, what would it look like if we decentered white voices and imagined therapy as a vehicle for justice? What would we do differently in the structure of our therapy? What would we change in the language we use? And where would we advocate for policy change? Here are some people who have been doing that and did do that for many decades. Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Bancroft Clark used their research in the groundbreaking Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that desegregated schools. Martha Bernal was the first Latina woman to earn a PhD in psychology, and she wrote extensively about multicultural psychology and ethnic identity. Beverly Daniel Tatum wrote, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she argues that racial identity is crucial to the well-being of children. Harold Napoleon wrote Yurak, The Way of the Human Being, and he explores collective trauma resulting from genocide, ancestral trauma. Another important figure was Ignacio Martín Baró, who was a Jesuit scholar and psychologist, and he conducted research on Salvadoran campesinos. He pioneered a field he called liberation psychology. And his central question was, how can we make psychology more relevant to marginalized people who are the majority of the world? And he too says this is not easy. He himself will say, I'm not coming to you with a solution. I'm not going to lay out a step-by-step program for how we're going to do this, because it's not easy to figure out how to place ourselves within the process alongside the dominated rather than alongside the dominator. But these are some of the things that he explored and talked about in his works. He thought in terms of psychosocial or collective trauma rather than individual trauma, and socio-political therapy. He says, it becomes hard, more or less implicitly, for the disequilibrium inherent in social struggle not to be interpreted as a form of personal disorder, and for the conflicts generated by overthrowing the social order not to be considered as pathological. So he's saying there is a normal human response to oppression that we often interpret as a psychological disorder, as a pathology, when it is nothing of the sort. It is a response to a pathological system. The foundation for a people's mental health lies in the existence of humanizing relationships, of collective ties within which and through which the personal humanity of each individual is acknowledged, and in which no one's reality is denied. We cannot separate mental health from the social order. So he's questioning the overemphasis on individuality there. He talks about affirming and giving voice to the realities of the oppressed, developing a critical consciousness of the lies told by oppressors, reclaiming historical memory, and shaping a new identity for people as members of a human community in charge of a history. Taiwo Afwape describes liberation psychology as redirecting psychology away from a preoccupation with pathology, otherness, control, and efficiency towards an emphasis on social justice, empowerment, collaboration, and compassion. Psychology might then be better able to facilitate liberation and be less a potential instrument for oppression. This mural is up on the wall in Caresen, which is an immigrant advocate nonprofit in Los Angeles. And here they have a painting of Ignacio Martín Baró there being carried by a lot of people. Testimony therapy is another example. It was created by Chilean refugees who saw how profoundly healing it could be for survivors to tell their stories. It involves listening to the story with a strengths-based focus, reframing as we might do in narrative therapy, so talking about resilience and strength and overcoming, and then transcribing or creating a book of the story. So they would often recommend using covers and a spiral bound or some sort of binding so that it can be presented as a book and then given to the client. And they describe the process as transforming private pain into political or spiritual dignity. So it shifts the focus of therapy to the political, not so much the clinical. The story can also be used to help others, or in a legal case to build evidence against violence and oppression. I often think about this in working with asylum seekers, where we will do a forensic psychological evaluation and then write up a psychological report and submit it to their attorney for their case. And this can be an enormously healing process for a lot of people. It can be extremely difficult, and it can also be a way for people to feel that they are using their story for good, for their good and the good of their family, and also to raise awareness, to fight for their community. So participating and advocating legally for people can be one way to use this. This type of therapy has been used and researched with many different populations now. A 2017 study with Khmer refugees added a Buddhist ceremony to the therapy and was shown to be effective in reducing anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms. It can be brief, adaptable, and it can be used with many different populations, even in low resource contexts. And lastly, some other things that have been shown to be crucially important is connecting to ethnic identity. A recent study conducted by the University of California found that discrimination causes psychological effects in children as young as 7, including anxiety and behavior problems. The study found, however, that children's level of identification with their racial and ethnic groups buffered these effects so powerfully as to make them nearly disappear. The more children were anchored in their history and culture, the less discrimination could hurt them. Social support and collective identification has protective power for many oppressed groups, including women, lesbians, gay men, and international students in the United States. That's just a brief overview of some of the literature reviews that I came across. So now we're going to open up the discussion, and I've written down some discussion questions to help spark the discussion, but feel free to say anything else that you add your own questions or own comments. I would be happy for that. I would highly encourage that. Our moderators, Carol and Andrik, have been reading the chat as I've been speaking, and they will be trying to address everyone's questions. Because of time limits, we might not get to everyone, but we will certainly try our best.
And folks, because we still have the share screen PowerPoint on our screens, it would be a little hard for Andrik and I to be able to see raised hands. So if you could use the icon of the raised hand on the bottom, on your chat function, I think, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, type your question into the chat, or let us know in the chat that you want to speak, and we can also more easily see you that way. Thanks.
It's helpful if I stop sharing.
Well, I don't know. The questions are actually really useful.
Okay, sure, I'll keep them up for a while.
Andrik, go ahead.
Yes, we have a question from several people. If the presentation is going to be available online for them to download or have access to the content, because they consider it very interesting and they wanna further have access to it.
Great. Yes, we are recording and we are planning to make it available via YouTube. Is that right, Tara?
Yeah, so we'll have a recording available. And yeah, Robin, if you don't mind sending me your slides, it could include that as well.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Tara or Robin, do you have the ability to paste the questions into the chat?
Oh, sure.
And then we
I
can,
do that.
Elaine and Pierre have suggested that as a good way to put us all back on screen.
That's a great idea. Okay.
We have a couple of questions that prefer to remain anonymous. I will pass them along to you. First of all, first one is, what advocacy is being done to educate donors on different ways of supporting non-white clients?
That is a great question. Carol, I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit. I know more about PTV in particular than other groups, but I'd love to know your thoughts.
You know, I don't know if I have like a real solid answer for that, but I understand the question because I don't see it in the chat. But it's about educating donors on supporting non-white folks. You know, I think it's state by state, different foundations and different state government funding sources have put out calls or are open to holding discussions on diversifying the pool and bringing funding and making it available to typically underserved communities. However, it isn't that we haven't found an easy way to access donors in that are inviting us to the table all the time. So there are places that we can go in, but I think we've been trying to make a very hard effort into breaking through those spaces. And then once you get in those spaces, it's also the challenge of having your voice and your perspective heard, because those spaces are still typically dominated by the communities that are in privilege and power. And it's decades and centuries long of trying to unpack. So there needs to, I believe, be a lot more organization amongst ourselves as social justice advocates and people of color advocates to probably publish a lot more and to have our voices heard, because even as POC therapists or POCs in the mental health field, we're still struggling a lot to be understood and to be taken seriously, that the perspectives that come from a non-white paradigm are valid perspectives and have a really different way of entering into the healing relationship. So I don't know if that answers the question at all in any way, but I would certainly open it up to anyone else in this space that might want to contribute.
We also have a second question, anonymous question as well. And this is, how can people of color, how can POC staff in white-led organizations undertake this work when it is so different from the status quo?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is an uphill battle. It is very different from the status quo. I would love to open up that question to the group if there are any who want to share. I'd love to know what you see as useful tools, how you have advocated in our field as well, what sort of support is out there too.
Yes, thank you. And
Andrique, would you be able to type that question into the Everyone forum so that people can reflect on the question as well?
yes, of course.
Thank you.
Of course, I can go ahead and do that. We also have a couple of comments that I would like to invite the people who share them. One is public, actually, from Laili. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Laili Kagani, and I don't know if she would like to, if they would like to add to our conversation or speak about it a little bit more around the subject of spirituality. And also I have a couple of comments as well. Okay, let me go ahead and type that. And our first comment is, I don't know, Adriana, do you want me to, can you send a message if you want me to share this comment? Because I am not sure if when you're sending a private, in a private manner to me, please note if you want it to be anonymous, please. Okay. Do we have any other questions or raise hands at this moment?
It might be a good idea to go question by question so that folks can kind of focus.
I've seen a couple things in the chat as well, wanting to know more about story-based therapy and specifically the study on Khmer refugees. I can definitely send some links when I send the slides to Tara, and we can post that into our the recorded presentation that we post later.
And I guess we'll go ahead and read Layla's question because I'm not sure if she wanted to, Layli's question, if she wanted to read it herself, but here it is. Can we also include a discussion of spirituality? It's often very difficult for individuals to feel they can bring their faith or spirituality into the therapy room. Oftentimes, spirituality and faith is treated as a cultural factor when it is beyond conceptions of culture for many individuals, although that can be one lens through which it can be appreciated in some settings. Robin, do you want to just tackle that?
What a great question. It's true. It does get sort of otherized too, that, oh, this is just sort of a cultural idiosyncrasy instead of central to people's well-being. So it is something that I try to explore in therapy with each person and to get a sense of how they view healing and where they get sustaining healing. And faith and spirituality is often absolutely essential to that. So I do spend a lot of time exploring it, just asking questions, talking about their history, where they have found it helpful, if there are things about their spirituality that have been difficult for them to make sense of. And sometimes that leads us into, if you've ever read The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, there's lots of great moments like that in that book where they talk about how we can't separate that from the medical model. We can't say there is spirituality and then there is medicine and there are two different things. It would have been way better for the people, say, presented in that book to say, how can we integrate these? How can this be part of the holistic view of healing for them? And the family themselves said, we need a little bit of medicine and a little bit of our spirituality. That's the way we view healing. And I've had people say to me, I think the symptoms that I'm experiencing are the result of a curse that someone put on me. And so, then I will say, I'm not sure that I have the skills to say, know what to do about a curse, but I would love to explore that with you. And maybe we can incorporate people in your community to help us. Maybe we can help put you in contact with people who themselves have a lot of, say, spiritual wisdom so that they could help guide you, things like that. It is something I'm always thinking about and wanting to explore more in therapy. I would love, if anyone else wants to share, I'd love to know how others incorporate spirituality into their therapy.
I know I definitely, oh, I'm sorry. I think Muriel had her hand up. And we'll have to unmute Muriel. Go ahead,
Okay,
Muriel.
yes, thank you. I am not a therapist. I work with the International Rescue Committee in Denver. I'm the wellness promoter in the psychosocial support department. Just to small sharing about the stories and about the spirituality. I facilitate a program. It's been 3 years. This is the third year. It's going to be virtual this year, specifically with women of refugees, asylees, and asylum seekers. And it's based around stories. We just create, we're not doing therapy. We just create a safe space where women get together and talk and share their stories. And even based on lots of research, as you all know, probably that this kind of therapy, that's like the holistic well-being of refugees, proved to be more helpful than like the one-on-one classical therapy. And we're seeing great improvement. And during those meetings, we have a big space for spirituality where women can express any kind of spirituality they have, any kind of need, any kind of thing they believe that would help them and help the group. And it's also very open to not only sharing stories through words, but we share stories through dancing, through creating art. And all those tools are helping the women getting those connections with other people and getting this support where they're not judged and they're not expected to say things that we want them to say or to seek help the way that usually, like when you send referrals to, for therapists or counselor. And it's been an amazing experience for us and for them.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I just want to share a comment that someone made, Michelle Taylor made, about the spirituality piece. Speaking of spirituality, we would invite a spiritual leader of their choosing to say a prayer or speak after the client shares their testimony. And in their organization, they offer testimonial therapy in groups. And in this case, with the Congolese survivors from the same tribe. And she described that the storytelling was beautiful. Large groups of friends and families would dress up, bring food, and honor the testimonies of great pain that the women had shared.
Oh, wow.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to respond to this spirituality question before we move back to the first question that was posed? I don't see any hands up. Do you, Andrik?
I actually have an anonymous question, another one, and it goes like this. As a white therapist, I have been told I don't understand how Black relationships work by one of my clients. I am an emotionally focused therapist. When I try to prove for deeper emotions to undercover unmet needs, I've experienced pushback from some of my Black couples. When I get, while I get that maybe it is an issue of them not trusting me, yet I don't know how to deepen my understanding of Black couple relationships.
Thank you for sharing that. I know it's not easy to talk about challenges like that, and I think a lot of us try to figure it out on our own without asking the question of each other. And so I appreciate you sharing that because it really is important, and it's hard sometimes to know where to start. Would anyone like to share a response to that therapist? Any ideas for how to handle that challenge, to learn more? It might be a process of unmuting too.
Yeah, I think there's also an issue with copy pasting in the chat. It is not possible to just copy paste, which has been limiting. But there is another comment from
I
Yes.
just have a request from someone in the group that we go in order for the questions so that so we answer it fully before jumping to the next one. And we did miss one of the questions that was posed earlier. So I'd say let's go back to that one. So before we jump into the following and make sure that we close it out. There was one question that was first shared about how, hold on, I have to, it's kind of hard to go through the chat with a lot of questions in there. How can people of color staff in white-led organizations undertake this work when it is so different from the status quo?
Mhm.
And let's open that up for discussion before we jump to the next question. And I would like to ask if anyone from the participant groups here would like to share.
I saw Elaine had her hand raised. They may have unraised it. I'm not sure.
I think Elaine was raising her hand about the other question that
Okay.
another question. And Elaine, if you are raising your hand, just unmute, just type in a chat saying you want to answer this question. If I don't see it, then I will move to someone else. I will tackle that question if no one else wants to jump in. As a person of
Someone
color,
else has a raised hand. Sorry. Sanite.
I believe Sanite had a raised hand based on the spirituality question, but I
Okay.
will let her speak if she's. I will go. It's sorry, this is awkward. Can we unmute Sanite, please?
I'm going to change the settings so that you can choose to unmute yourself if you would like.
Thank you.
This will make it easier.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Sanite, do you want to respond to the spirituality question or to the people of color question? I'll go ahead and answer the people of color question and then we can move on. As for people of color working in predominantly white settings, I totally understand how difficult it is to challenge the status quo, especially if you're in a minority position and you don't have a cohort to be able to challenge it, because it is pushing against centuries of embedded theory and embedded practice.
Carol, can I speak? I'm sorry, I have.
Can you let me finish and then we'll let you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So I would say that it's not easy organizing amongst. Finding allies is a really useful way of getting your voice and perspective magnified. Be very, very prepared for a tremendous amount of pushback that can be very, very emotionally taxing and very demoralizing. I think one of the quotes that Dr. Jennifer Mullen had tweeted in her Instagram was about feeling depleted and emptied or feeling kind of dead. And that is something that is going to be a parallel process for you as a therapist bumping up against the institution. And it's super important to resource yourself with allies who understand where you're coming from and can help with pushing the agenda forward. And I think it is crafting a way for the mainstream to be able to see that there are many ways of entering into therapy, many, many ways, and there is not just one. And when you're working with people of color in people of color spaces or queer spaces or indigenous spaces, everyone enters into the healing modality in very different ways. And most people understand that the field of therapy has been white dominant, For me as a practitioner, a queer and person of color practitioner and an immigrant, my first step is to establish trust in a culturally centered way that the person that I'm working with really wants to bring forward. Not necessarily how I want to do it, but really inviting people to share what makes it most comfortable for them, breaking down the barriers, acknowledging that there are barriers and there are social political considerations, and then moving from there. But it's not necessarily just one way of doing it. And I think recognizing that there are many ways of entering into healing is really, really crucial and important. And the ways in which our regulations and laws have also been crafted are from a culturally biased standpoint. And this now is the time, and it's right, we are in a movement of civil rights revolution. This is the time for us all to be making change from top down, bottom up. So all of us, POC or non-POC, have to be taking this moment to really work together if we really see that there are problems in our system. So thank you for letting me vent. But Sanai, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Carol. I don't know which one. I'm going to go to spirituality first, and I can touch a little bit as a social worker, therapist, what you say. I can second what you say. So the spirituality, we predominantly serve detainees and also immigrant refugees. So spirituality has been very important to us as an immigrant. Where we came from, mostly we depend on the spirituality. In other words, like faith-based organization is like the rescue mission for a lot of immigrants. So we make sure we do include it in the treatment model. There's a clinical look against from A to Z, but we must also partner spiritual leaders like imams and priests and preachers, and they can just join us and or refer them out, whatever it might means to that client. So we tend to include it in a treatment plan, and spirituality has been one. It helps because it's, in other words, it's a social support. Spirituality has different definition to everybody, but it's a major role in our treatment model as spirituality. I just want to mention that, especially when people have no any other social support and they're alone, and that's the only way they can be getting hope moving forward. So besides this clinical loop, non-traditional treatments that could be also defined, community defined treatment model. So it's very important, and we found a really great tool to add it to our treatment model, especially to build a trust that tends to escalate or increase the amount of trust between the client and the clinician. That's what I want to add. Spirituality is how important for immigrant refugee communities. The second point, you're addressing different rules and, you know, the domain culture, how impacted the clinician settings or the therapist. We really have to look at it from the client perspective, what we do. We have to focus on the case and the client's challenge, what we're trying to achieve, what we're trying to address, despite the challenges within the operation or the management, whatever it might be. So if we just focus one-on-one relationship with the client and it's just keeping client strength-based treatment, that would give us more hope and support working with the client versus focusing on this administration or the boss and whatever culture we have, organizational culture we have to deal with. I'm just sharing this with you from personal experience, and I used to be one of the therapists in the wet setting clinic. It has a lot to do, intimidation, but also things get better when you change your perspective towards the subject. What's the case? What I'm trying to achieve? How do I help? Just you have to partner with the client versus the administration. I just want to add that. And thank you so much for giving me a chance.
Thank you, Sanai. I know Elaine had her hand up. Do you want to go next, Elaine?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. And the first is about developing layers of natural leaders of the communities that we all work with within community-based organizations. In our experience that we've had through the institute that I founded, we have found that when we bring into the conversation natural leaders, they help us learn what their community needs, that I could never know all the different things that individuals need from different communities that I've certainly encountered around the world. So that is one of the things, is that how do you develop natural leaders to change the paradigm? Because I think natural leaders also help with the decolonization, which has been a top-down approach. And the second is I'm very invested, some of you know me, in body-oriented, and really keep looking at the individual holistically. So the one therapist who said she had a particular way of working with African-American couples, I would say broaden the scope, get trained in more modalities. The more things that you're trained in, the better you are equipped to bring in different things that may help the families and the individuals that you work with. And then finally, I have to say, my mom immigrated to this country from El Salvador. And one of the reasons why I also strongly believe in natural leaders, even though I'm a licensed clinical social worker, is that I know that she would not have ever gone to see a therapist. She had very great needs, and yet she also had beliefs about you keep things within the family. And so I think that's where the natural leaders come in, because sometimes the natural leader can reach out to someone who wouldn't be amenable to traditional therapeutic approaches. But I liked what Carol said when you were talking about the bottom-up approach rather than the top-down. Well, also I think that's the same thing with bringing in a holistic perspective, because I think if we look at things holistically, spirituality cannot be left out if it's part of the person's experience, and it's part of just being. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Yes.
There was another question that came out that kind of links to this one from Hui Pam, who has had to leave. He says, a story of David and Goliath, and can be overwhelming and feel hopeless. At the present moment, what do you think are some actionable priorities to decolonizing therapy in our field of refugee mental health and torture survivors specifically, between clinicians who are predominantly white in the field and clients who are majority Black Indigenous people of color, or Black immigrant Indigenous people of color? Robin, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, overwhelming is right. And David and Goliath is a great analogy. It's true that it's helpful to have some actionable steps, some things that we can put into practice today to try to do this. I think one of the great things that's happening now is that we're all educating ourselves more. I mean, if you see the New York Times bestsellers right now, a lot of people are becoming more aware and wanting to read more and wanting to learn more. There's lots of webinars like this that I've been attending to try to learn more and to hear lots of perspectives. I think doing that is something, and it's a really positive thing to take the time to reflect. I think another thing we can do is advocate at the policy level for change. You know, one of my coworkers is on the board of behavioral sciences, and she had a meeting with them recently where they put out the question: do we think we should let people with different immigration statuses get licensed? And she very strongly advocated, yes, 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 absolutely. And that's one policy level action she could take to say, here's where we can start to make change. When we can, like you said, Elena, is we can start to have leaders across the board in all levels of our field, that is going to start to make change happen at a faster pace. I think for us, a lot of things as a field are the people who give us funding is another important question that was brought up earlier, because it is a problem. It's a huge problem in our capitalist system that mental health is tied to health insurance, is tied to documenting in a certain way so that you can report things correctly. There are so many therapists who don't make themselves available to people of low income or people who don't have health insurance. And I think we should all start to think about that critically and to think about multiple ways that we could make ourselves accessible other than people being self-pay or having to have health insurance. One thing PTV does is a lot of grant writing. So grant writers can be advocates. If we can find the right grants, if we can offer certain services at no cost to people in whatever way we can, then we can start to make mental health more accessible to the larger community. Just the fact that Dr. Mullen has her Instagram feed where she posts lots of different ideas every day, a new way to think about something, a new way to take care of yourself, a new idea for mental health. That you don't have to come to me and pay for a session to get some of this information. We can make it more accessible to everyone through lots of different avenues. Those are some things that come to mind for me. I would love to know if anyone else has thoughts too about how to start to change the system in an actionable way.
There was a suggestion on a private chat on the chat asking if this group or members of this group might be able to stay connected in order to further the advocacy or the movement of this discussion is bringing about. And that could be a really good small or first step that we could take as a community if people are interested. And we could certainly host that type of a forum.
That would be wonderful. I would be thrilled. Maybe we
Yes,
could
that
talk
would
more
be
about making that happen.
great.
Power in numbers and all.
Also, in reference to the David and Goliath story, there was a comment made earlier that I wasn't sure if it was private, and now I know that it wasn't. And I would like to share it since this person shared this comment, Adriana shared this comment a while ago. It was one of her first interventions. I don't know if
Go ahead, Andrea.
Can I share it right now?
Okay. Go ahead.
It says, I am an immigration attorney working with unaccompanied children. When drafting declarations for asylum and trying to elicit details from my young clients, I at times bring up the violent history of their country, Central American countries, to provide context for their stories. I get blank stares because they're unaware of their history. Essentially, it seems I'm trying to create a historical legal book for my clients. But if they are ignorant of their own story, any suggestions on how to approach my clients?
Could I share an experience around that? If
Yes,
you can hear me. I was working with a client who had a similar, who fled their country because of persecution, but the way that they explained it was God punishing generations of that country for selfishness. And so I guess, I actually don't know if I have an answer except for the way that I worked with that is that both could be true. That her interpretation of the persecution could be, it was her reality of like an explanation based on religion or her faith, and then sort of in that process, because we were also working on an evaluation, was to explain why it's important to frame it in a different way for
an audience that may not understand, yeah, her perspective. But I've come across that a few times. So I'm also curious what others think around sort of not imposing, not being in the position of saying you're oppressed and this is why. So that's been challenging for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think recognizing the both and is the balance that we kind of strike or try to strike in the healing relationship. And as an attorney or even as a forensic evaluator, and we do forensic psych evaluations as well, it's good to be transparent with our people, to let them know that, look, this is a strategy that we have to take to strengthen the evidence that is going to support you in the asylum case. And I wonder if you're aware of the history of your country, or maybe you're not, it's too overwhelming right now because you're still healing and this may not be very important stuff to you, but this is the lawyer's strategy, and the lawyer is going to be talking about the history of your country. You can figure, just be open with folks around, this is where it is and this is why it's there. And they may or may not agree, but yeah, I don't know. That's just one strategy of kind of being transparent and being clear that it may or may not be the strategy that they are in agreement with. And then go from there with the discussion. But most folks, at least that we work with, at least in my experience, haven't really had the energy to go into the history, but most folks have an awareness that this is what's been happening in their political climate. I feel that most folks from other countries actually have more of an awareness of their political circumstances than people who live in the US, because of the way our media system is created, who controls our media here in the US, that we're kind of getting more and more cut off from reality and history.
Indeed.
Any other thoughts around that particular question?
Yeah, I think in my role, I don't often do a lot of educating around history. I could see how an attorney might need to do more of that so that the client understands their own case. And I like your idea, Carol, of saying, so here's our strategy and here's the history I'm going to be incorporating, and then maybe we could use that to ask them, would you have anything to add to that from your experience, your knowledge of your country, so that we could incorporate that into our story too?
Thank you. I found your suggestion very helpful. Usually the clients that aren't really aware, interestingly enough, are primarily my indigenous Guatemala little clients. And what I have found is high levels of alcoholism given my client stories again. And it may just be part of the residual effects of the concerted violence and the massacres that occurred there for that have been still ongoing for some time. And maybe this is not something that's discussed. Maybe this is something that is just suppressed, kind of like this is life. And right now, if we don't have the militia in here slaughtering us, this is all good, et cetera. Maybe, but they're really unaware. And it's interesting. So I've always wondered, when I broached it briefly, it's really blank stares. And I'm thinking, am I doing more harm? Do I remain quiet? Do I find a different a different particular social group to identify my client to state their claim for asylum, or I don't know, but thank you. This has been instructive.
Okay, welcome, Adriana. Andre, before we go to the next question, I just want to read out Pierre's comment because it links to this one. Pierre, do you want to read your own comment, or do you want us to read it?
Sure. I don't mind reading it. I said, white-centered practitioners, we have to also do the body-centered work of deprogramming ourselves and addressing how white supremacy shows up in our subconscious mind. because I keep on hearing that conversation around trainings and cultural competence, and it all goes back to educating the brain. I think it's very important that we, as white folks, really do the practical work, body-centered work, and really unroot all that programming that's been happening in the past 400 years. It takes a lot of work. I know I'm not aware of that many spaces who are offering that. I've mentioned Menachem's grandmother's hands work, which I trust everybody's familiar with. And I understand there's some practical exercises in there. But if anybody knows of where to do these exercises in a group setting in a more structured way, I am very much interested in learning more. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Yeah, Rasmus Menachem's work is really useful. And at PTV, we're doing a lot of theater as healing work with a number of different theater practitioners, and maybe, I don't know, it's theater for refugee practitioners. So maybe that might be a way. It's still, it's evolving, but it could be something useful. Enrique, do you have the other question that came up?
Yes, this is an anonymous question. How do you help white therapists who might be unaware that they are taking on good or non-racist views about themselves in clinical supervision without them taking the defensive stance further?
Could you read that one more time?
Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. How do you help white therapists who might be unaware that they are taking on good, between quotes, or non-racist views about themselves in clinical supervision without them taking the defensive stance farther? How do you address the white privilege point of view that therapists, well, I believe this is what the question is about. How do you confront a therapist that is not aware that they're playing the good non-racist card without escalating the conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it sounds like this might be a person who is a supervisor who's wanting to help her white supervisees get further down the road of understanding. It's true, and it's not easy because defensiveness is, in my experience, is often the first thing that happens. It's true. And I think a couple of the things that I've seen make progress in these conversations is sharing stories, saying, we might think about this, we might think about this person's experience and their story. Like when that person when I was at the conference and we had the group discussion and the white therapist said, I don't see color. And then the black therapist said, well, if you were to say that to me, here's how I would feel. And I, as a white therapist, might say to a supervisee, if you were to say that to me in the room, here's what would go through my mind. Or when I have seen people speak that way in therapy, here's how it seemed to go. Or you could read things together. You could say, let's read an article together and see what you think about that. Let's read this book together and see what you think. Or let's attend this webinar by a person who knows a lot more about this than we do and see what we think about that. To sort of align together in saying, maybe there's more to learn here, and maybe there's a lot that can be gained by a more humble approach of saying, I don't know everything yet, and I need to learn from people who have been doing this work for a long time, and here's how we can do that. Here's some people we can approach to learn from. That would be my first thought, but I would love to know if anyone else would like to add to that.
I think the answer is also nuanced based on whether you're a supervisor of color or whether you're a white supervisor and your supervisee is white or non-white or whatever. How that also affects who you are in that relationship. As a non-white person, I've had to have I've had interactions with like this in many settings, not only as a supervisor, but as a colleague and as a human being in life. It is, I don't see myself as not affected by a racist society. So I don't think I'm like super woke or super beyond being having prejudices and biases. So I try to ensure that I'm also reflecting on my own stuff, because I have a ton of privilege. I have a license, I have a master's degree, I went to school, I speak good English, I don't have an immigration, I mean, I do have some immigration vulnerabilities, but I'm not like likely to be deported tomorrow, maybe in a month. But so it's sort of to try to put a white person at ease. I've had to do a little bit of work, not like instilling guilt in the supervisory relationship, but this is, let's work it out together, because both of us are embedded in this system. And I may not feel it. In my first line of interaction in the world is as a brown person. It doesn't matter that I'm queer, it doesn't matter that I have an education, doesn't matter that I speak English, doesn't matter that I have a master's degree, whatever. What you see is what you get, is what is perceived by other people in whatever ways. But as a South Asian person living in this country, I have a ton of privilege. I'm assumed to be a model minority. I'm assumed to be accepted into spaces that a Black person probably wouldn't be accepted to as readily as I would. So I acknowledge that in the room with the person in denial and just unpack my own stuff, so that maybe it would invite the person on the other side to be able to see, oh yeah, well, that's true. So I may be woke, but I still have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of work to do. We all do. So it would be kind of impossible for any white person to think that they were beyond needing any work, or any brown or Black person to be beyond needing any work. This is lifelong work that we all have to do all the time. It doesn't just end after the 1 hour session. It's what we breathe in and breathe in and breathe out every day. It doesn't go away. It's there. It's just whether you want to open your eyes to it or not. So I think inviting the person into that conversation is super useful, and putting yourself with that person as an ally to try to break down those defenses, if that makes sense. Are we about at time? We are about at time. We are like 2:30. I wonder if there are any last thoughts or comments. I don't know whether we got to I think we've probably missed a few questions, but we'll try to keep this forum going and have you guys back to continue this and maybe be more action oriented as we move through it. Thank you so much for participating. Robin, do you want to close out?
Thank you all so much. I'm going to post some resources too when we post the recording. I wanted to also answer that person's question who had been challenged by a Black couple saying you don't understand Black relationships. I'll post a couple of resources that I found helpful. One is BEAM, which stands for the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, and they might be a great resource. There's also Dr. Tama Bryant Davis has a wonderful website and lots of instructional videos. So I'll post some resources too, and if people are interested, I would love to meet again and continue this conversation together. So maybe we'll think about some ways to do that when we post the recording too. Okay, thank you all so much, and feel free to get in touch with us anytime.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Receive an email from us soon.